morning from New York, I'm Chris Hayes. With critics calling for UN Ambassador Susan Rice to resign over allegations the administration lied about who is behind the deadly attacks on Americans in Benghazi, Libya, Senator John Kerry last night called for Rice to stay on. And the Republican Party has severed ties with a Virginia-based consulting group. It has paid almost $3 million to this year alone. The group is being investigated for voter fraud in 9 counties in Florida. Right now, my story of the week. The Republican bubble trap. If you follow politics, you've probably noticed that polling of the presidential election has swung quite decidedly in the president's favor over the last few weeks. The Real Clear Politics polling average now has Obama up 4.1 points over Mitt Romney in national polls. And Nate Silver's prediction model at his 538 blog put Barack Obama's odds of winning the election above 80% for the first time ever. Swing state polling out just this week seems to confirm the trend. A new Quinnipiac University New York Times CBS poll of swing states of Ohio and Florida shows surprisingly strong leads for the president. And the Gallup tracking poll, which has showed a near-dead heat for almost the entirety of the campaign, now shows Obama up 6 points. It's pretty hard to survey the polling data and not come to the conclusion that Barack Obama is beating Mitt Romney, that if the election were held today, Barack Obama would win, and that Romney has a relatively steep, though certainly not insurmountable, uphill climb to victory. That is, of course, unless you operate in the alternate epistemic universe of right-wing media.
That begs the question, are these polls dishonest?
No, look, we endow them with a false scientific precision they simply don't have.
These polls, I don't even pay attention to them.
Polling is very good at saying how you're going to vote. It's very bad at saying who's going to vote. And the models these folks are using are crazy.
These 2 polls today are designed to convince everybody this election is over.
We should note that Fox News' own polls have been pretty much in line with everyone else's. But it's not just observers making the claim the polls are rigged. The Romney campaign itself is now getting in on the act.
Some of these polls have been called into question because they assume a higher Democratic turnout in 2012 than we experienced in 2008.
For the record, that's not really true, but that doesn't matter. Conservatives are spending hundreds, maybe thousands of man-hours, or more appropriately bro-hours, writing long, tortured, pseudo-statistical takedowns of every new poll from a wide variety of outlets. The proprietor of one of the go-to sites for this kind of analysis, unskewedpolls.com, told BuzzFeed that his traffic has gone from 15,000 hits a day to 200,000. And buoyed by the huge uptick, the site's founder, Dean Chambers, is planning an expansion. Quote, I've been hearing from people inside the Tea Party movement and Republican movement calling to say they support what I'm doing, Chambers said. It's given them a boost of confidence. They're glad to see that someone's questioning the credibility of national polls. Now, to the conservatives and Republicans watching out there right now, I know what you're thinking. It's not just people on the right who fall victim to this way of thinking. And you're right. In fact, I can recall with somewhat pathetic acuity spending hours on the internet in the waning days of the 2004 election, searching out any and all articles or blog posts about why the lack of cell phones in the call lists of the major polls led to underreporting John Kerry's strength. We all, as humans, are subject to confirmation bias, the urge to find information that reaffirms our ideological priors. But the problem is that the institutional structure of the American right slavishly caters to this disposition. The institutional and market incentives on the right all push towards feeding the audience what they want to hear and make a good buck while doing it, at the expense of actually giving them a handle on some basic aspects of reality. Glenn Beck left Fox News to create his own hermetically sealed media environment where he no longer has just a radio show, but now his own website and TV network, where the latter routinely runs stories first reported by the former. While his audience has shrunk dramatically, NPR recently reported that business for Beck has never been better. His company, The Blaze, is expected to rake in more than $40 million this year. His radio contract just doubled to $100 million over the next 5 years. The increasingly claustrophobic parallel conservative universe isn't just something that lefties like myself have noted. Julian Sanchez, a Cato libertarian who moves in social circles of both liberals and conservatives, coined the term epistemic closure to describe the alternate reality found in, as he put it, the, quote, multimedia array of interconnected and cross-promoting conservative blogs, radio programs, magazines, and, of course, Fox News, where, quote, whatever conflicts with reality can be dismissed out of hand because it comes from the liberal media and is therefore ipso facto not to be trusted. How do you know they're liberal? Well, they disagree with the conservative media. This epistemic closure can be a source of solidarity and energy, but it also renders the conservative media ecosystem fragile, unquote. I think we are seeing right now just how prophetic Sanchez was. The political problems the Republican Party is now facing, losing ground not only in the general election, but a wide swath of congressional races, is due, I think, to the fact that the elites of that party have become so used to operating within the confines of conservatism, they've forgotten how to persuade people that don't already agree with them. The "We Built This" theme for the Republican convention was a tone-deaf inside joke that played off an intentionally misconstrued supposed gaffe that didn't really seem to resonate with the general electorate. Look at the difference between the reaction to Clint Eastwood's speech inside the hall, where it was met with raucous laughter and enthusiastic applause, to outside the hall, where it was met with something more like confused amusement. And the ultimate example of the cost of the conservative bubble are Mitt Romney's 47% comments, versions of which have become commonplace to the point of cliche in right-wing circles, and ones which Romney offered inside the safety and comfort of the conservative bubble, but have now leaked out to the general populace, where they are rightly found noxious. In the song 10 Crack Commandments, Biggie Smalls offered a set of rules for drug dealers who want to avoid the perils of the trade, and one of them was a piece of age-old advice. Never get high on your own supply. Same goes for political strategists. Never confuse your own talking points for the truth. Don't start believing that everyone out there in the voting booths is seeing the world the way you do. The GOP has, I think, lost sight of this simple wisdom. They are now smoking what they're dealing. It's a big part of why those poll numbers look the way they do, and a good reminder of the dysfunction and incompetence that happen when people in charge only listen to themselves. I'm going to talk to my panel about the consequences of living inside the conservative bubble when we get back. We're talking about the increasingly cramped confines of the conservative bubble in which I think a lot of political operatives on the right are now operating, and how that is hurting them in the general election, possibly as a good clue as to why Mitt Romney's not winning the presidential election, why he's down, and why also other congressional candidates and Senate candidates are doing poorly. Right now, I am joined by Sheila Bair, author of the new book, Bull by the Horns, Fighting to Save Main Street from Wall Street and Wall Street from Itself. It's a very difficult fight. She's also former chairwoman of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, which is really a remarkable bureaucracy, and worked as research director and counsel to then Senate Majority Leader Republican Bob Dole. Yep. Great to have you here. Joe Weisenthal, deputy editor at Business Insider and the fastest man on the internet. MSNBC contributor Joy Reid, also managing editor at our sister website, thegrio.com. And Josh Barra, columnist at Bloomberg View, whose recent post about Mitt Romney, quote, having lost the election when the 47% comments came out, is the most read article in the history of Bloomberg View, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
It was 90 billion views, page views, was that right?
We're pushing 100 billion now.
100 billion page views, yes.
I'm going to retire.
So, that's right, off the royalties from page views. If only every writer in America.
Isn't that how it works?
Isn't that how it works? I found the polling stuff to be kind of remarkable this week. I mean, the polling, I think, look, let's not overstate how accurate polls are. I mean, there's margins of error, and it's also possible that we are systematically getting something wrong. I mean, there were models of the big Wall Street banks that were systematically mispricing real estate assets for 6 years. So let's not put too much confidence in models. But I think if you're empirically minded and look at the data, the president is winning the race. His lead has increased over the past month or so. It looks like from the polling we're seeing the 47% comments have hurt him and have hurt Mitt Romney. And yet there is an increasing industry growing up on the right to just deny this. And I'm not even sure what the point of it is. I mean, maybe you're right, but then isn't it all just going to on election day be exposed as I'm just fascinated by the growth of this industry, Joe.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I see, and this is outside of politics because I write about economics so much, is I use charts a lot in my writing and, comparing public sector employment, private sector, and I see the same thing all the time. People cannot, just this aggression against data or this convinced that all data is manipulated or data is a lie. So, if I show that private sector employment has actually done relatively well under Obama, relatively well compared to past recoveries and so forth, and that most of the job losses have been in the public sector, people just think it's a lie. The debate ends because I can't, there's nowhere to go from there. They just refuse to believe it. I see this happen all the time. I think what I thought when I saw the unskewedpolls.com site is well, this is really embarrassing. I just normal people escaping to the shelter of this poll that site went up a week ago.
Yeah.
And like when we put up posts about it, there's like we were getting tons of search hits for it. So there's obviously just this huge thirst. And of course, as you said, I remember like during past elections, every losing candidate has had this. The Hillary voters in the 2008 primary had their own circle. They were convinced that the support for Obama was way overstated. You're totally right about 2004, the 2002 like every election this happens. But the weird how this really happened in the last week was kind of remarkable.
But I mean, isn't this, I think this is sort of a subset of a larger kind of trend on the right? And it's been going on for a really long time, that there's this sort of combination of self-pity and sort of feeding the idea that they are victims of this massive conspiracy by the left to lie about everything and that they are truly the majority. I mean, I've been calling it the funhouse mirror, but I love your characterization of it even more. But there is this notion that everything is a lie. Right. Climate change is a lie. You know, the idea that liberals are just lying to you all the time, this distrust of media, distrust of numbers, distrust of data. Everything is a lie.
It's also funny because a lot of the Paul Ryan supporters are like, it's not politics, it's just math. That's like a lot. Math became like it's kind of funny because liberals talk about science, right? And now conservatives are like all this budget stuff. Look, sorry, it's just math. We have to slash Medicare and so forth. And so it is funny that the party of math now is like creating their own alternate math.
And Sheila, I want to get your thoughts on this because I just want to note for people watching this. Josh, you worked on Mitt Romney's 2002 gubernatorial campaign.
That's right.
You've been a Republican. I don't know if you're a registered Republican.
I am a registered Republican.
You're a registered Republican.
Yeah.
You worked for Bob Dole. So I just want to make sure that people watching, we're not just a bunch of liberals sitting here talking about like those crazy people out there, because you've been in the Republican Party. You worked on the Hill in the Republican Party. I think you consider yourself a Republican now, although I don't.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I'm curious what you make of this. Am I wrong? Is this just a natural human instinct that the internet cultivates and people just do it? Or is there a broader issue here with this kind of turning inward that's happened, I think, among the right?
Well, I think it's kind of a silly debate about the polls. And you're right, all the polls is showing consistent trends. And I think where Republicans should be focusing is their message. And their message is not resonating. And they are, what my generation would say, they're listening to their own rhetoric. They're
as opposed to getting high on their own supply.
That's right. So, I think Bill Clinton really nailed it at the convention. He said, I think you do have a vulnerable incumbent. The economy is not in good shape. But what the middle voters, which are the voters who are the voters that Mitt Romney needs to speak to, what they're hearing is that we want to reduce taxes on the rich and deregulate again, and that's what got us into trouble. And and I think if they think that we just want to repeat the things that brought us the terrible problems we had in 2007 and 2008, that's just not going to resonate. And I don't think that is his message, but that's what's coming across. And they really need to be focusing on that, not whose poll is right.
Do you think that is a product of just some tactical errors now, or the product of a sort of broader shift in the balance of power within the coalition that is the Republican Party?
I think it is part of the balance of power. I think there's a certain at the extreme, there's a certain core that just wants to unseat this incumbent no matter what, and they don't understand that you need to provide an alternative. And people aren't they're not going to vote against somebody. They've been burnt before. They want to know what Mitt Romney is going to do, and Mitt Romney is going to help everybody, not just certain segments of the population. So
isn't the problem that Mitt Romney is only speaking to this base that denialism is sort of their core now? They didn't believe Bill Clinton was legitimately elected. It had to have been conspiracies of fraudulent voters. So we have to now legislate voter fraud because the only reason Democrats win is that it's all fraud. The election itself is a lie. Barack Obama didn't really get elected. Acorn somehow manipulated the electoral system to place this fraudulent foreigner into the White House. He isn't American. There's denialism about everything. And I think they've built up a media that is willing to cater to this sort of sense of denialism and victimology. So if you just hermetically seal yourself into conservative media, you can believe that it's all a lie, right?
I think we've seen this on the left too, though, and I think when we look back to 2004, it's not just the polls before the election, but then the insistence afterwards that the voting machines in Ohio were somehow rigged. But I think the left got past that. They didn't go into the 2008 campaign.
And there were structures in place institutionally in which that was, again, there's a human instinct there, right? The question is, are the structures in place institutionally there that people that pursue that line will profit greatly, right? Is there an incentive to pursue that such that you can get a huge check or huge prominence or actually like get elevated? And that, I think, to me is a big question.
Well, I think the nice thing about this example is that we'll know in 6 weeks. The election will be over and we'll know whether the polls were correct or not. And I don't think that the Republicans are going to insist that the election was stolen. As barring an outcome like Florida, where there's really some, which I don't think is going to happen. So I think the party will have to get past this because they will have a reality check. It's not like climate change where you can deny the data and then you have to wait 100 years to figure out whether you were right or not. This one at least is time limited. But the thing that Unskewed Polls most reminds me of is this network of websites on the right insisting that the inflation statistics are rigged and that really we've had 8 or 9% inflation for the last decade. And that I think has also been disproved, because if that were true, we've been in a recession for 10 years. If that's correct.
Right.
People still believe that.
One of the things that's really interesting that's happening right now is there's a debate happening among the right that is the debate that should be happening after Election Day, like why Mitt Romney lost, which is happening right now. But it's still a very close race. Like, it's still a very winnable race for Mitt Romney, I think, A. And B, I also think all the big money is contributing to this. And I want to talk about how that plays into this right after we take this break. So one of the factors I think that's driving this, the message of the Republican Party being oddly tone deaf in terms of talking to middle class voters particularly, is the influence of big money, is the influence of the donor class. We saw the Republican National Convention, the "We Built This" theme, which I thought was just a really tone deaf theme. It was based on a supposed gaffe by the president, which itself is obscure. It was like telling an inside joke. And then it was also skewed at entrepreneurs who are great. I love entrepreneurs, great people, but a very small portion of the electorate. Most people work for someone else. The vast majority of voters have a boss. They go to work every day. They're signing, as someone said the other day, the back of the paycheck, not the front of it. And so I think part of what's driving this, aside from Mitt Romney's position, is the fact that you have all these huge donors in the super PACs and in the world who that's their worldview. They want to see themselves celebrated, and they believe that if only you celebrate them, if only you give the folks the rhetoric they want. And this is what you saw in the questions in the infamous 47% tape. You saw people being, why don't you go around and talk about your success, right? And I think actually we're seeing the effects of big money negatively on the Republicans because this big money is pushing them towards messages that actually aren't that effective.
I don't think this is principally about big money, because I think this is a message that really sells to the Tea Party base in the Republican Party, which does not principally consist of people who are very wealthy. I think it's a message that does sell to actual small business people, which is one of the most conservative demographics voting groups in the country. People who own small businesses are much more likely to vote Republican than wealthy professionals of similar economic means. So I think that the reason that Romney feels trapped in this message or feels compelled to keep using it is that it does sell to a significant part of his base. It's not just a few people giving him a lot of money who like it.
No, but I mean, I don't know that that's true, because if you look at, I think the biggest trick and sort of the most genius thing that the right has done over the last 30 years is get sort of cloth coat Republicans who, like you said, receive a paycheck rather than writing one, to kind of worship the job creators and to sort of have this reverence for these business people. And when I was in Tampa, we were both in Tampa for the Republican convention, it was a giant sort of self-pity party for people who are rich and who want to be celebrated. You see the Wall Street, sort of the Wall Street whining about why is Barack Obama mean to us? Why doesn't he celebrate us? Why doesn't he say how great we are? And then culminating in the tweets on Labor Day from Republican lawmakers saying Happy Labor Day to bosses, entrepreneurs. This is your day. No, it isn't. It's Labor Day,
No, I agree. I think We Built That theme does resonate certainly with a broad base of the Republican Party. And I think that with middle voters it does as well. We are, culturally a nation, and we celebrate hard work. We celebrate entrepreneurship, innovation, and even people, who work for Apple, they still celebrate Steve Jobs as, one of the best entrepreneurs to ever hit our economy. So I think it does resonate, and I think you need to be. I understand what the point he's trying to make. I think Elizabeth Warren probably did it better early on, but you do need to be careful because, in some ways, just stating the obvious. Government has a role. They have infrastructure, education, and we all need that to perform our jobs or start our businesses or whatever. But, is it going the next step and saying, well, no matter how successful you are, we're going to take some of it? I think that's kind of what people were hearing, and I think that's where the president needs to be careful. And I do think that theme did resonate.
But you could imagine. I mean, you're a perfect person to channel this. You can imagine a very effective conservative Republican message that was also kind of anti-Wall Street.
Wall
Street. Yes, well, exactly, right. I mean,
not anti-Wall Street, independent of Wall Street. Yeah.
Right. Well, but and the question is, why has that? I think
that's one of the great mysteries. I mean, I think this is where right and left should agree. I think this is not ideological. These guys are still threats to our financial system. They should stand on their own 2 feet. Taxpayers shouldn't have to bail them out. That's a good conservative principle. That's a good progressive or liberal principle. I don't understand why.
Here you might be getting to an issue that really is about the donor base.
Yes, thank you. I was just leading everyone to water. So thank you for taking a sip.
I know who are like pounding the table. Mitt, take on Wall Street, take on the banks, take on really hit this issue hard. And I think it would resonate with a certain ideological wing. It would resonate with a lot of people that aren't ideological but just are really upset with the bailouts and still think that the bank bailouts are a big reason why the economy is not so great and so on. But I think it would be too alienating. And so there is this sort of anti-Wall Street. It's combined with kind of a hard money crowd.
Yes,
sort of
I find them fascinating. Those folks.
Yeah. You have to. But it's just too impossible. I just have a hard time seeing that really get all the way up to the top, given the source of so much money and the way Wall Street has really shifted
because of the donor base. I mean, this is the thing, right? He is. I mean, we've seen all the stories about Wall Street shifting their donations to Mitt Romney because they don't like being called fat cats. And obviously Mitt Romney comes from the financial world, so he's not a great messenger to talk about the depredation.
There is an argument that would just look completely absurd.
But I mean, do we not? I mean, we've forgotten, I think, including we in the media, that the Tea Party movement started with Rick Santelli, who is a financial reporter from CNBC, standing on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, not complaining about Wall Street, but complaining about deadbeat homeowners. The Tea Party movement itself was Wall Street people complaining about poor people or people who were in trouble financially.
But it took. I think it took root because of some actual genuine anger at the banks. I mean, I totally agree with you.
But it's so ironic, right?
Right. When we lose sight of that, because people say, "Oh, it started against the banks." No, it started yelling at homeowners, losers, actually, in Rick Santelli's exact words.
Right.
But so I think there is an opportunity to split both the Republican base here and the donor base. I think honestly, there are people in the hedge fund industry who view increased bank regulation as a business opportunity because they think it'll clear space for them to get in businesses that banks won't be allowed in anymore. So I think there is a message that could be crafted that would have a financial base on the right and would appeal to a lot of voters who see the banks as having gotten a free ride. But I think John Huntsman tried to be in that space, but then he also tried to be. Well, but he was also kind of like.
I'm writing him in. No.
Are you really?
At this point, I am. Yeah.
He was poking social conservatives in the eye for no good political reason, and sort of. I think he was a flawed candidate.
There is a little bit of an inconsistency in the way a lot of so you hear a lot of populist deregulation. So it's we're going to repeal Dodd-Frank, but
that'll really screw those banks.
You hear that, and so it's just a really difficult message for all kinds of reasons.
I want to talk about the other huge cost of the Republican bubble, which I am more and more convinced has it goes by the name of Paul Ryan. I think if you look at the polling, actually, naming Paul Ryan the ticket was a big mistake. Let's look at some of the numbers in Ohio and Florida that show that right after we take this break.
There are 47% of the people who vote for the president no matter what, who are dependent upon government, who believe that they are victims, who believe that government has a responsibility to care for them, who believe that they're entitled to health care, to food, to housing, to you name it. And they will vote for this president no matter what. And so my job is not to worry about those people. I'll never convince them. They should take personal responsibility and care for their lives.
That's the new ad the Obama campaign is running, I think, in 7 swing states. That's not just like something you put on the web. That's running in swing states. They put a lot of money behind that. I think it's pretty brutal. They didn't try to gild the lily, just let it speak for itself. Official Up With Chris Hayes policy, obviously, that all guests at the table are entitled to food, which is why we have this. We believe that you're entitled to food. What I said before the break was that I think when you look at what's the thing that is pushed the polls apart. There's the convention bounce, the 47% comments. But if you look at the internals, Noam Scheiber at TNR at the New Republic had a post the other day I found persuasive. He said, look at the internals in Florida and Ohio. Look at Florida. Huge swing from Romney to Obama among those 65 and older in the last month. Okay? Late August, President was down 13 points in Florida among people 65 and older. Today, he's up 4. We see what the actual results are. Obama is now beating Mitt Romney. He was down Ohio polling. Obama was down 8 points among people 65 and older. Today he is up 1. I think that's, and Noam writes, I think persuasively, that Republicans, again, get smoking what they were dealing, thinking that their desire to see the end of Medicare, to see the entitlement state vastly shrunk, was actually a popular political message broadly, decided to double down on it by putting Paul Ryan on the ticket and going right after it. And these are the results.
Yeah, I mean, I think much like playing the Notorious B.I.G., you are spot on once again to say that is it. Because I looked at those same internals and said the only thing that has changed demonstrably is seniors. And not only, it's huge because seniors have been so resistant to Barack Obama. They've been the one constituency that has not warmed up to him at all. And in 2010, they were a big reason why that wave washed up against Democrats. Now you actually see in Iowa, in Ohio, in these swing states, seniors moving back for one reason, Medicare. And putting the only thing special about Paul Ryan was this budget that he put forward that wants to voucherize Medicare. By putting him on the ticket, Romney owns it, whether he likes it or not.
Which they all voted for and convinced themselves was a smart thing to do. They walked the plank on a vote that had it was purely symbolic. It wasn't going anywhere. And yet they got the entire caucus to vote to voucherize Medicare. I'm talking about the first round of the Ryan budget, right? The whole caucus voted for it.
And then they voted for the second version, too. They voted for it twice.
I think it's a different, you talk about bubbles, I think that's actually a different bubble than the right bubble. That's kind of like, people call it the serious people bubble. So it's actually kind of bipartisan. Right. Or in Washington where you have
that's a good point.
Democrats, like the whole Simpson Bowles thing, where you have people on both sides of the aisle thing that wonky-ish, I don't even think it's like wonky, but that kind of like specific proposals about how we're going to, reduce plays.
The average voter.
So within elite circles and a big swath of the media, I would say there is like this glow that envelops people who take on these things. And I think the public does worry about the national debt and the deficit in the abstract, but as soon as it starts coming to specifics and you start talking about, what's really going to cut, it doesn't seem to play very well.
I think this is interesting in part because the Republican strategy on Medicare was a little more complicated than just vote for this.
No, it was much more complicated, very tangled.
What they were trying to do was split it, where they were going to say if you're over 55, you're going to keep what you have now, and in fact, we're going to spend $700 billion more on Medicare over the next 10 years. Paul Ryan instantly reversed the position that he had when he was in Congress. His budget kept the president's Medicare cuts. Romney says he'll repeal the Medicare cuts, and now Ryan says that too. And it looked to me at first like that was working, that they were actually managing to sort of get to the president's left on Medicare and attack him and say the president's going to cut your Medicare, we're going to protect it. I don't know why it's not still working.
Well, here's why. They've decided they're going to pick this fight on Medicare, and it's a bizarre fight they've picked for exactly the reasons you named. Clearly, they're the party that wants to shrink the entitlement state in the long run. All you have to do is read what Republicans say and see what they say in behind closed doors, or even read conservative blogs or the Wall Street Journal editorial page. We all know what the conservative apparatus and the Republican Party thinks about the entitlement state. At the same time, they wanted to say, actually, we're going to be more extravagant to you seniors on entitlements.
Right.
But broadly, what they did was they made the mistake of picking a fight on an issue that the Democrats have all this reputational capital built up over time, and it's not sustainable. If Democrats went out and tried to convince the electorate that they were the party that was going to give more tax cuts to the rich, it would not be possible. It's not a credible promise. We all understand which party does that and which party opposes it. You can't swoop in 2012, and I'm seeing this play out. When I was in Nevada, all these ads are being run by Crossroads GPS and stuff about Medicare. I'm thinking, this is madness. If you're a Republican, don't pick a fight on who's going to spend more on Medicare. That is not your comparative advantage, right?
And not only that, but don't try to divide current seniors from future seniors. You're basically saying,
well, that might be smart politically, actually.
But it isn't working. I mean, what we're finding out is that seniors care about Medicare for the future, too, and that they don't like the idea of changing the program, period. And if you say, well, for your grandkids, they're getting a voucher, they don't like that either.
Before I let you go, Josh Barro, a bit of advice, a smart point from my friend Matt, who emailed to reference the Big E 10 Crack Commandments, saying that we missed a very important piece of advice from Mitt Romney. Advice number 1 in Big E's 10 Crack Commandments is never let him know how much dough you hold, which that Mitt Romney is listening to. He may be ignoring the never get high on your own supply. Josh Barro, columnist at Bloomberg View. Thanks for your time, man.
Absolutely. Good to be here.
A major new revelation about the strength of the Obama recovery. Up next. We've We've been discussing new poll numbers suggesting the presidential election is shifting decidedly in the president's favor. For months, the conventional wisdom among the political establishment has been this election would be a nail-biter, that the lagging economic recovery would weigh the president down, and Republicans figured all Mitt Romney would have to do is ride vast waves of economic discontent into the White House. But somehow, despite what appears to be on the surface to be a dispiritingly slow recovery, President Obama is surging. In Ohio, a must-win state for Romney, the president is ahead by 10 points, according to the Quinnipiac University New York Times CBS poll released Wednesday. The same poll found him up 9 points in Florida. And perhaps even more surprisingly, voters in both states now trust President Obama more than Mitt Romney to turn the economy around. As New York Times columnist Paul Krugman put it on Thursday, quote, "This really isn't looking like the election anyone expected." So, what happened? The predominant theory seems to be that Mitt Romney is an inept candidate, that his repeated gas has set him back against an otherwise weak incumbent. That may be true, but the facts suggest something deeper and more important going on. The economic recovery may just be a bit more robust than we've all assumed. A striking example of that came this week when the Bureau of Labor Statistics announced it had underestimated the number of jobs created from March 2011 to March 2012 by a massive 386,000. Taking those new jobs into account, President Obama has now overseen a net positive 125,000 jobs added to the economy, even if you take into account the massive job losses from the financial crisis at the start of his term. And that wasn't the only economic bright spot this week. On Friday, the University of Michigan's Consumer Confidence Index reached its second highest level of nearly 5 years. Joining us now to talk about this is Ro Khanna, author of Entrepreneurial Nation, Why Manufacturing is Still Key to America's Future, and former Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Obama Commerce Department. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so we know the headline numbers. We have GDP growth revised down. GDP growth continues to be sluggish. I don't think anyone anywhere thinks, hey, awesome, 1%, 1.2% GDP growth. Let's just have that for another 10 years, right? No one likes that. Unemployment, too high. No one is happy. Well, except for some of the people on the Federal Reserve Board, apparently, is happy with unemployment above 8%. And yet, I think the economic picture is a bit more complicated than the headline numbers indicate. And I've actually, as someone who's been a very critical from the left of the recovery, have been surprised. Joe, are there things you're seeing in the data that suggest why voters seem more bullish on the economy than you might anticipate they would be?
Let me just break it down how I see the economy. I think there's two ways of looking at it. One is the economy is bad. The unemployment is way too high. GDP growth is slow. It's really disappointing. We'd like it all much stronger. On the other hand, there's this relative way of looking at it compared to other crises, compared to what's going on in Europe, compared to what's going on in China, where you have to be impressed by the resilience of the U.S. When you look at it from the voter's perspective, I think there are two interesting things. One is housing is starting to come back, and I think the positive effects of that are going to be huge in terms of wealth effect, in terms of what people feel comfortable spending their money and so forth. This was the core of the collapse, and now it's coming back. And then the other thing is this sort of steady improvement. The non-farm payrolls creation is spotty, but you see this steady improvement in the decline of jobless claims. Yeah. And that is like a sense of everyone looking around, you're seeing fewer and fewer people being laid off all the time. And I think that has to create a positive feeling for a lot of voters that things are consistently getting less bad.
We have a few charts. Let's go to the charts here. This is the jobless claims year over year, and you see them falling off since 2009, right? So basically, that number has been about negative 10%. So every year every week, jobless claims have been about 10% lower than they were a year ago. That's an incredibly steady improvement. Basically, for 2 years, no worsening of that trend in a long time. Here's household debt as a percentage of GDP. Obviously, a huge amount of debt was accrued during the bubble, and a big part of what's called a balance sheet recession, which is what we've been experiencing, is getting rid of it. You see that's starting to come down, although if you look at that graph, there's a long way to go, right? That's household debt as a percentage of GDP.
That's one reason to think that this recovery is going to be slow for a long time.
Because this is
also the debt that really affects people. So when people talk about the debt in politics, they're usually talking about the national debt. Right. This is the debt that was at the core of the crisis, and this is the debt that's actually improving.
And then finally, I want to. You said compare it to post-crisis recoveries, because this to me is fascinating. When you start, it was clear the campaign in the White House thought, the absolute numbers are rough in terms of re-election, and we have to make an argument about the counterfactual, about how we saved the country from real peril. And there's been a lot of debate on the left, on the right, about the rescue plan, the bailouts. a policy known as extend and pretend, which is basically to kind of hand wave at the housing problem.
Right.
You make a case that that's actually been quite effective.
Yeah.
You make a case in your book that it's unjust and somewhat outrageous, and I'd like you guys to litigate that right after this break. We're talking about the economic recovery and the role it's playing in the campaign and the ways in which it has not created the political drag on the president one might assume just from looking at 8% unemployment. And one of the arguments that the White House has made in the re-election campaign is it could have been worse, the rescue was really effective, and I think the conventional political wisdom, and I will cop to this myself, is that you can't sell counterfactual arguments to voters. And I actually think they've done a pretty good job of selling counterfactual arguments to voters. I think they've been so insistent on reminding everyone of the crisis. And Joe, you put up this chart on Business Insider the other day about comparing employment recovery in various different financial crises, right? So Sweden had a financial crisis, Spain had a financial crisis, Japan. And what you see is that the U.S., which is that red line there, right, is doing much better, right? Things cut off and didn't go as deep, and it's coming back faster than almost any other one, except for Japan, which just kind of stays the same for 20 years. You're very critical of a lot of the actions that were taken that around the rescue. Do you feel that it was the right thing to do? Do you feel like the policy was handled well? What was wrong about it?
Well, I think in 2008 we were dealing with a situation potentially spinning out of control, and so we threw a lot of money at it. We were flying blind. We didn't have a playbook. I didn't really like what we did then, but I at least understood it better. But in 2009, we did have a stable financial system. And I am a rip the Band-Aid off kind of a person. I think that's really when we should have started imposing some discipline, at least for these very sick institutions, making them sell their toxic assets into a competitive process that would give them a realistic mark about what they're really valued. I mean, that's continues to be a problem with bank balance sheets. A lot of the assets are held at inflated value. By doing that, you create new balance sheet capacity to lend. If you just prop the bank up and leave all the bad assets there, what do? They nurse their balance sheet over a period of years. They're very conservative. When you get into a business cycle, you want a healthy institution willing to go in there and take some risk and lend into an uncertain economic situation. Sick banks with a lot of bad assets just don't do that. It was also, there was the moral hazard problem. I'm sorry, there was. There needed to be some accountability. There never was. We just kept bailing institutions out. And I do think, and the housing policies have not been effective. We should have done a lot more. That was part of troubled asset relief, is to get the mortgages restructured. We didn't really do that very well either. So I do think we would have had a more robust economy if we had dealt more. We'd tried to fundamentally restructure bank balance sheets in 2009. We didn't. And, I guess I'm trying to prove a negative now, too.
Sure.
Better, but I do. And I think history is really more on my side than his, but we'll hear him now.
Well, no, but I want to get you to weigh in on this. One of the things I think is interesting is I remember the big debate in 2008. What do we do with the toxic assets? Right? There's all these toxic assets. What do we do with them? And then it was just kind of like, whatever happened to those? Right. Now,
well, it's hard to deal with them. I mean, it's easy to write write checks to big institutions. It's hard to set up a facility, set up an auction process. They would have taken losses if the government had forced them to sell. It was mainly bad mortgages, a lot of bad securities, a lot of bad commercial real estate loans. But you would have had some type of pricing process to know what the true value of the assets are, which would be very helpful market information, and you would have expanded balance sheet capacity to lend. So,
Ro, what's your thought?
I think we have to remember, though, where the economy was at that point. I mean, there was talk about the market going down to 3,000. Mm-hmm. There was a fear of actual collapse. Mm-hmm. And I think what the president did is said, let's stabilize the economy. Mm-hmm. And I think what's resonating in Ohio and other places is also his focus on manufacturing, on exports. Mm-hmm. And people are responding to a sense that he has a long-term vision of what's going to make America economically competitive. So I think what the president's strategy was is let's balance stabilize the financial system and then build a new, strong foundation.
But what is that vision? I mean, part of the issue there, right, is that there's the vision in the future, which he talks about all the time, and then there's the current problem. And I felt sometimes a little lack of urgency coming out of Washington about the jobs crisis, particularly from the Republican Party, but even in terms of the way the president talks about the present from the White House itself in terms of talking about jobs.
Well, I think that the president, if you look at what they did with the Small Business Administration, with the funding of loans to small businesses, with the export initiative, with the focus on manufacturing for the first time in 30 years, I mean, those were things that were going to create jobs. And even on China, the huge debate about who's going to be tough on China. Just yesterday, the news was that the Chinese currency is the highest it's ever been relative to the dollar. And I think that led from an administration focus on the Chinese currency. So I don't think that there was a sense that immediate jobs don't matter, but I think Americans are very smart. They care about our economic future, and I don't think it's right that the long term doesn't sell. I mean, people have a stake in whether we're going to be a great economy, and I think the president's vision is selling. It's the immediate and the future.
Well, but you know what's interesting, though, is I think during that time, and I think I find myself agreeing with you on this, is that moment when TARP happened, that was sort of the last time that we had sort of a bipartisan agreement that we have to act together for the future of the country, right? Since then, you've had Republicans, I think, hedging, in part because I think from a political standpoint, a bad economy would be helpful to them in the elections. But at that moment, I mean, you had John Boehner weeping on the floor of the House asking people to pass TARP, which Republicans just didn't organically want to do, but everyone sort of did it. And I do think there was some caution in the stimulus. And I do think that we did sort of miss an opportunity for holding Wall Street accountable. And I think that moment was partly because of political caution, maybe. I don't know what it was, but it does feel like we could have done that.
Wall Street's influence is very, I do think this administration's economic team has been Wall Street friendly. I do. And I think the president's got the worst of both worlds because they don't like him because he's been publicly critical of them.
Right.
But I think the economic team has been pretty friendly to Wall Street. And the thing about the bailouts, so would you do the bailouts again? I mean, I'm sorry, it just makes my skin crawl. When I say these bailouts were great, they saved the system, they made money. I mean, the cynicism that has been created, the moral hazards have been created. I guess a lot of people on Wall Street would just like to take this risk again. They've got to put on the government.
I want to. Both are true. That the bailouts were a good idea, but that we could have done more to hold accountability.
And we had to do something. We were in a crisis in 2008, but in 2009 we had stabilized the banking system. We could have imposed some accountability there. I think there were people in the White House. I think there were people at the Fed. I think there were people at the Treasury who wanted to do that. It just didn't get done because of the top leadership of the economic team.
Hold that thought. Senator Sherrod Brown's going to weigh in on all this when we come back.